College of the Atlantic. It's great to see a nice, large, and diverse audience. My name is Darren Collins. I'm the president and an alumnus of the College of the Atlantic. And I wanted to thank John Visvader, who is a faculty member at COA, who organizes all of the Human Ecology Fora. And he's not here today, but he did a great job allowing us to work around David's schedule and have this Friday session, so that's great. So this afternoon we're welcoming David Sloan Wilson to COA. David, thank you so much for coming. David's a distinguished professor of biology and anthropology at the State University of New York, Binghamton, and is the founder of the Evolutionary Studies program at that institution. Along with Jeremy Lieberman, he also co-founded a nonprofit organization called the Evolution Institute. And that organization seeks to apply evolutionary theory to some of the world's most pernicious problems and most interesting projects. And my hope, and one of the reasons I've asked David to come, is I hope that he sees us here at College of the Atlantic as one of those very interesting institutions and interesting projects. So I'm not going to enumerate all of David's publications. They're long, varied, and excellent. The list runs at least 8 in terms of his texts and includes Rethinking the Theoretical Foundations of Sociobiology, which he co-edited with E.O. Wilson, and then most recently in 2015, Does Altruism Exist? Was his most recent publication. And a lot of David's work centers around that concept of altruism, or coevolution, multi-selection theory, and among other things, those were the core concepts that I think brought him to the College of the Atlantic first about 18 months ago. 18 months ago, COA held the Society for Human Ecology talks here, and David was a participant in that. And during that initial conversation 18 months ago is when we had just a very interesting dialogue with David, and we were really inspired to put COA in David's Petri dish. And so that's one of the things we hope to come out of this conversation. So we've invited him back. He's generously spent time in the class of Bill Carpenter and John Anderson in a class called Heaven and Earth, and now he comes to the COA community to give a community-wide talk tonight. So without further ado, let's welcome David Sloan Wilson.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. So indeed, I am interested in COA. I don't know, some of the metaphors that you used are a little disturbing. Hopefully not too disturbing for the audience, but here are my objectives. Should be dear to the heart of the College of the Atlantic, which is so centered on human ecology. So my main message is that human ecology needs to become evolutionary human ecology. Some of you might be thinking, why is this not already the case? I think most of you probably accept Darwin's theory of evolution, and so what would be new about this? And to answer that question, I want to provide a historical perspective. So here's the beginning of our timeline. Here's 3 momentous events in world history. The first is the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. The second is the formation of the College of the Atlantic in 1972. And then the formation of the Society for Human Ecology, I think that was in 1995. So that sets our time window. And I want to take that phrase, human ecology, and divide it in 2, and to spend some time first on the ecology part and then some time on the human part. The word ecology was coined by Ernst Haeckel in 1866, and it developed largely as a descriptive discipline. Now, just as Linnaeus cataloged all of the species without having much of a theory in mind, then I think ecologists cataloged different ecological regions as a descriptive project. And so we can ask the interesting question, when did the word evolutionary become applied to the word ecology? And the answer to that was mostly during the second half of the 20th century. 2 landmark books was this one in 1965 by G. Evelyn Hutchinson, who was a Yale professor, called The Ecological Theater and the Evolutionary Play. And then the first textbook with the title Evolutionary Ecology was published in 1974 by Eric Pianka, now in its sixth edition. So the word evolutionary got tacked on to ecology during this time period. We can locate it pretty close smack on to the formation of the College of the Atlantic. So what does it mean for ecology to become evolutionary ecology? Ecology is defined as the study of the relationship of organisms to each other and their physical environments. Evolution tells us that organisms are a product of natural selection, and so therefore the study of ecology, that's the ecological theater in Hutchinson's poetic phrasing, needs to be informed by evolution, the evolutionary play, as he put it. Stated thus, it seems that it cannot be otherwise. Hutchinson, in 1959, wrote a classic paper called Homage to Santa Rosalia, or Why Are There So Many Different Kinds of Animals? And this was one of the great exciting publications of its time. And it began with the empirical observation that when you collect animals, and if two species within the same genus, in other words, closely related species, are coexisting in the same location, they tend to be different in size. And the explanation for that is that basically evolution drove them to be different from each other. If they were too similar, then they would compete too much. One would go extinct. So what that does is that drives them apart. That was true for these water boatmen that he studied, and in a larger sense, it's true for adaptive radiation such as Darwin's finches, which drives them apart. And so the size difference, what you see out there, basically biological diversity, is based on evolution, in this case focusing on a history of competition. I was a graduate student at this time. And I was at that time just an evolutionary biologist. I wasn't really studying people so much. And this is what was exciting us all. This was the forefront of ecology when I was a graduate student, especially optimal foraging theory. And before then, of course, what animals ate was a big topic. It had a large literature, but there was no really theory about what animals ate. And so what would that theory be? What happened with optimal foraging theory was a prediction, basically a question. What would animals eat? They were products of natural selection. So basically their feeding behavior had been adapted to maximize their fitness. Well, some more assumptions are necessary to proceed with that project. So let's assume that natural selection favors individuals that maximize their energy gain per unit time. It doesn't have to be that way. There's other possibilities. But if so, then we could think of each prey type as providing a certain number of calories and requiring a certain amount of time to handle. And based on that, you can build a mathematical model that predicts what animals would select. Rather than get too formal about it, this is a game I played in my ecology classes for a long, long time. So there's a bowl of coins. You see lots of different coins there. Imagine that this bowl was in front of you, and you could pick a coin one at a time. You could only pick one at a time. You could keep your earnings. What would you do? Tell me what you would do.
Pick quarters.
Well, thank you. I didn't plant you in the audience, but if quarters are to be had, then you should only pick quarters. And so now you do that, and let's say you deplete the quarters, then what would you do?
Look for another ball.
I definitely didn't plant him. So what would you do when the quarters begin to be depleted? Okay. Now, would you ever pass up a quarter when you find it? No. Okay. Now, on the issue of dimes, it turns out what people actually do in the experiment is they start accepting dimes and nickels more or less at the same time. Why would that be? Dimes are small and hard to pick up, and nickels are a little bit easier to pick up, and so their handling time is a little bit different. And you have to factor that in. You don't accept pennies, and you would not accept pennies until you've depleted all the higher values. Well, there in a nutshell is optimal foraging theory and how animals were predicted to behave. And this idea that you could actually predict what animals would do, not just for optimal foraging theory, but for many, many, many different behaviors, and not just behaviors, but anatomical structures, life history traits, just about anything was just revolutionary and requires thinking in terms of evolution. So this is a lot of what it meant for ecology to become evolutionary ecology. Now here are some things that happen in this tradition, and I think that really needs to be part of human ecology. The ecology part of human ecology needs to include this. And this is not just what took place in the 1970s. This is what's been taking place since then, coming in towards the present. One is on the topic of ecosystems, because often we need to study nature at large scales. This is very important. We need to study carbon budgets, by the way, for example. And so ecosystem ecology developed to study larger scales with such foundational concepts as nutrient cycling, energy flows, breaking up nature into broad categories such as producers, consumers, decomposers, so on and so forth. And what gradually emerged, basically, is that although you can make a certain amount of progress on this basis, frankly, you cannot understand ecosystems without understanding the species that compose ecosystems. Those species are products of natural selection, so they follow strategies such as optimal foraging strategies, and that has tremendous impact on those ecosystem processes. So ecosystem ecology must be species-based, and by being species-based, that means being grounded in evolution. The beaver in this picture, for example, is an optimal forager. That means when it moves into an area, it selects the most palatable trees. And in doing so, the remaining trees, the reason they're unpalatable is because they have all kinds of toxins, such as tannins and the like. And guess what? Those decompose more slowly. They often also change the water chemistry. And so everything about the ecosystem has been changed by the beaver. But the ecosystem doesn't work better than it did before. It's just different than it was before, based on the adaptive strategies of this one keystone species. So ecosystem ecology has to be evolutionary in the same way as species-oriented ecology. Another development that's been more or less dawned upon us more and more is the idea that variation exists not only between species, but within a species. Very substantial variation within a species of the same sort that we already know exists between species. So one example is this Arctic char. This is one species in a lake which lacks other species. And so it is diversified in the same gene pool into 4 morphs, very different from each other. So intraspecific variation is a lot like interspecific variation. Back to those trees. A single species of tree can vary 100-fold in its toxins. And so when the beavers move in, not only do they selectively remove some of the species, but they selectively remove some of the individuals within the species. And you can't understand all of that without including intraspecific variation in addition to interspecific variation. This has led to the phrase ecosystem genetics, which just tells you how we need to go from bottom to top. Another very important development. All of these have long roots, but they become more and more central as we move towards the present. The idea that evolution operates on ecological timescales. So many people think that evolution is a slow process, so slow that it's standing still at any particular moment. So that if the species that we're studying today and that are interacting with each other today are going to have their properties during short time periods. But now we know that that's not necessarily the case. Natural selection is so fast that the species of tomorrow is not the same as the species of today or yesterday. One of my favorite examples is the cane toad, which is from South America. It was introduced to Australia. And initially it started to spread at a rate of about 10 kilometers a year. But now think about this. Here's the species in a new continent, and it spreads a certain amount, and it varies in its movement, because all species vary. It varies in its movement. Which individuals are going to be at the edge of this invasion front? The species that move the most, the individuals that move the most. And then their progeny, they vary, and then every step of the way, what the invasion front is intense selection for movement. Intense selection for movement. And several decades later, the invasion front is now moving at a rate of 40 to 60 kilometers a year, not 10 kilometers a year. If you would assume that the species was standing still, then all of your projections about its movement would be wrong. And selection for movement has been so strong that it's compromised the individuals in almost every other respect. They have immune system dysfunctions. They don't reproduce very well. Their bones break down. They're like insane athletes. They're just training too much. The ones that are radio tagged, that move single individuals who have a single kilometer a day. They're just born to move. So this is one of the nicest examples of evolution operating on ecological timescales. This is so important for modern environmental biology. This is an article that appeared in Science magazine in 2015 on the need to take this in, basically, applying evolutionary biology to address global challenges. So this is a good summary. And then a kind of a flip of that is the concept of mismatch. Although evolution can be fast, often it's not fast enough. And so the environment that's inhabited by a species is different than the one that it evolved in, and the adaptations become mismatched. One of the most famous examples of this is that when baby sea turtles hatch and they come out onto the sand, of course they need to make their way to the sea. Well, how did they evolve to do that? What's the cue that they used? Reflected light. So they're attracted to reflected light, and then for millions of years that's taken them towards the sea until you put a beach house on the other end of the beach. And then they're attracted to that. And so that's catastrophic. Unless we do something about that, that's going to drive the species extinct probably. And so we try to do things such as having lights out, as this poster attests. So there's many, many examples of mismatch. In our role as environmental biologists, we need to then have all of this in mind. There's like 3 different inputs of evolution. First, the species is a product of long-term selection. We need to know about that. Second, evolution operates on ecological timescales. We need to know about that. Third, when environment changes faster than the species, then we need to know about the mismatch. You can't do any of that without tacking the word evolutionary onto the word ecology. And so there's our timeline, basically. All of this leading up to the present has been taking place more or less since the College of Atlantic came into existence. Well, now let's switch and focus on the human part of human ecology, and beginning with this book, Sociobiology, published by the other Wilson in 1975. And Ed and I did indeed write a paper together called Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Sociobiology. This was a landmark book. I think Bill was telling me when he read it, how thrilled he was. Is that right?
I was.
Yeah. So you went pounding on everyone's door like a Jehovah's Witness, evidently, and saying, you must read this. You must read this book. Its thesis. Its thesis was much in line with evolutionary ecology, is that the social behaviors of all species can be understood from a single evolutionary perspective. It was hailed as a triumph, except for the last chapter on humans, and that created a storm of controversy. So at that time, this is a place marker. It was forbidden, unacceptable to study evolution in relation to human behavior in 1975. Why might that be? A very long history there. Darwin, if you go back, clearly regarded all aspects of humanity as within the orbit of evolutionary theory. It's amazing when you read him that he was studying his children, he was studying morality, he was studying expressions of emotions, everything. He was dismayed when Alfred Russel Wallace more or less became an exceptionalist with respect to humans. But nevertheless, the way that developed was highly problematic. I really could not escape the Victorian imagination. So theories of cultural evolution became linear and progressive. European culture was the superior culture. It goes on and on and on. Evolution was used to justify social inequality, although that in itself is a very complex story. And so we're actually addressing this in a series of essays that we're calling Truth and Reconciliation for Social Darwinism. This is like one of those messy, conflictual episodes, like political repression that does require a truth and reconciliation process. So there's good reasons why many people became avoidant of evolution in relation to human affairs. This cover of Time, I think, tells part of the story. Is that what it means? Is that what sociobiology means, that we're all puppets now being manipulated by our genes? And that's not what it means. Does it mean that there's no free will? These are some of the avoidant reactions. And so what that means is that the word evolutionary was only started to be added to the major human-related disciplines even later than for ecology, not until the 1990s and the 1980s, and in the case of the study of religion, something that I've been involved in, not even until the dawn of the 21st century was there a serious effort to think about a major topic such as religion from a modern evolutionary perspective. That's how new it all is with relation to humans. So let me take a piece now, maybe 10 minutes or so, to just give you a flavor of what all of this is about. So, and going back to the worldview that preceded Darwin's worldview, it kind of went without saying that if the universe was created by a beneficent God, then his creation must have been harmonious from top to bottom, from the tiniest insect to the cosmos, must in some sense be part of God's plan. And the first Enlightenment thinkers, although they were now placing their emphasis on reason and science as opposed to Scripture, they were departing from a religious thinker in that respect. They more or less thought that science would affirm this particular part of the Christian worldview. I think that even includes Darwin early on. But actually, Darwin's theory, as he soon discovered, implies otherwise. It raised the disturbing possibility that the kind of functional order that we associate with a human implement, such as a watch, or a biological organism, might cease to exist for an entity such as a society or a multi-species community. So order might yield to disorder as we go up in the scale of nature. And he was led to this realization by considering how the traits that we associate with altruism, cooperation, solid citizenry of all sorts, how these traits might evolve that are for the good of the group, might evolve by a Darwinian process. And here's the fundamental problem in modern terms. It begins with the fact that natural selection is based on relative fitness. It does not matter how well an organism survives and reproduces in absolute terms, only that it does so better than other organisms in its vicinity. So relative thinking is one of the very basic but very disturbing and in some ways perverse implications of evolutionary theory. So when we're thinking in terms of relative fitness, then it becomes pretty clear that the traits that would benefit the group usually require individuals doing things for each other. And so therefore, these traits are typically not selectively advantageous within groups. It's the selfish traits that actually deliver the highest relative fitness within groups. So how does altruism writ large evolve? And this problem goes beyond the highly sacrificial traits that we typically associate with altruism. Just to show you how dire it is, let me ask you to imagine a trait that benefits everyone in the group, including the actor, at no cost to the actor. So let's say that I'm a type of individual, and magically I can benefit all of our welfare at no cost to myself. We all gain. I'm floating all boats with what I do. And imagine a group that has a certain proportion of my kind, let's say 20%. Here we are. Everyone benefits from our presence. Well, what's the proportion of my kind at the end of all of that? It's 20%. It's 20%. My kind does not increase in frequency at all. Natural selection requires differences. And I just gave an example in which there are no differences. So anything that floats all boats or sinks all boats is neutral as far as natural selection is concerned. You might think that we might be able to promote altruism with a system of rewards and punishments. But if you think a little closely about it, then imagine that I reward you for being altruistic. That costs me something, and everyone benefits from my action. And if I punish you for not being altruistic, that costs me something. And everyone benefits from my punishment behavior. So rewarding and punishment itself becomes an act of altruism that benefits the public good. Economists call this a second-order public good. And so this results in this dismal conclusion that natural selection within a group is insensitive to the welfare of the group. This is what Darwin encountered when he thought carefully about the evolution of socially beneficial behaviors. Yet there is a solution, and it's an easy solution, one that we can all understand. So it's true that altruism is selectively disadvantageous within groups, but in a multi-group population, a group of altruists will robustly outcompete a group of selfish individuals. That's as basic as the selective advantage of selfishness within groups. And so natural selection among groups in a multi-group population favors the evolution of altruism, as surely as a natural selection among individuals within groups favors the evolution of selfishness. So as Ed and I put it in our paper, selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups, everything else is commentary. And that's the best meme I ever created. That meme is now broadcast all over the place. Now we can stretch this out because nature consists not just of individuals and groups. We can go below the individual and think of the individual as a group of genes and a group of cells, and we can go above groups to a nested hierarchy of groups within groups within groups. And so the general rule is that adaptation, not selection, adaptation at any given level requires a process of selection at that level and tends to be undermined by selection at lower levels. In plain English, what's good for me can be bad for my family. What's good for my family can be bad for my clan. All the way up to what's good for my nation can be bad for the whole planet. That is the logic of multi-level selection. So there's good news and bad news associated with this. The good news is that the kind of functional organization that we associate with a watch and an organism actually can extend to higher levels. Groups can be like that. Groups can be a superorganism. So can ecosystems. And so that means that altruism and other traits associated with morality can be explained at face value as products of natural selection. This is huge because so often evolution is portrayed as a process which explains selfishness well and cannot explain altruism. Here we're saying that if you describe altruism to me, what counts as altruism for you, I can explain to you how it can evolve by a Darwinian process. The bad news is that special conditions are required, and these conditions can be quite restrictive. So although altruism can evolve, it does not necessarily evolve. There is still no justification for the Christian worldview that harmony exists at all scales. There's many, many cases in animal life and in human life where within group selection trumps between group selection. And in those cases, life's a bitch and then you die. That's all there is to it. So if we want to create harmony and order at larger scales, then we must work for it. I think here's where human ecology comes back into it. And without, this is why human ecology needs to be evolutionary human ecology. Well, here's an example of this, multi-level selection in human evolution. On our right, we have an average day in a chimpanzee troop, a little bit of cooperation and a lot of competition. Yes, chimps do cooperate to a degree, but for the most part, members of the same group are their chief rivals. And even when they cooperate, it's typically to create alliances that compete with other alliances within the same group. On our left, we see something that you'll never see in a chimp group. This is actually a group of hunter-gatherer children playing a game. And I just love the image of those feet forming a circle. That image just charms me. And so here's the story of human genetic evolution to the best of our knowledge. When you think of all the origin myths, including the Christian origin myth of Adam and Eve, and then we have the scientific origin myths of Freud's primal horde, and Hobbes, Freud's primal horde, or is that Hobbes? They both have that kind of vision. Rousseau's noble savage, then the economists have Homo economicus. We all have these stories about human nature. This is the real story of human origins to the best of our knowledge. In most primate species, members of the same group cooperate to a degree, as I've said, but are also each other's chief rivals. Even cooperation is in the context of small alliances. What our ancestors evolved was the ability to suppress disruptive self-serving behaviors within groups, causing between-group selection to be the main evolutionary force. We are a product of group selection, and so teamwork became the signature adaptation of our species. Teamwork takes physical forms, familiar forms to us: hunting, gathering, childcare, offense and defense and against other groups. Warfare was huge, extending deep into the human past. But teamwork also takes mental forms, including symbolic thought. Having a shared inventory of symbols is a form of teamwork. And transmitting learned information across generations, often in symbolic form, is also a form of teamwork. So what that means is that just about everything distinctive about our species, mental and physical, can be explained as a shift in the balance of levels of selection as a form of teamwork. This person, Christopher Boehm, an anthropologist who has studied both human cultures and chimpanzees, is one of the main architects of this view, and his book, Moral Origins, is part of a canon of books that really need to be read in order to gain this perspective. So then what happened was human societies became larger, not just with agriculture. One of the interesting things that's emerging is that human societies became larger even when they were hunter-gatherer societies, based, as far as we understand, on climate changes, basically. The climate became warmer and less variable. And so human populations could build up just on the basis of natural resources to a considerable size. And then that continued with the advent of agriculture in a kind of a positive feedback cycle. And when that happened, the size of human groups outstripped the ability of group members to control each other by this process of reverse dominance. And so ironically, human groups during a period of history became despotic, more like primate societies than like hunter-gatherer societies. But cultural evolution is always producing variation, and eventually that resulted in the modern mega-societies of today, which are much less despotic than in past times. By no means completely egalitarian, but you've really got to be impressed by the degree to which large-scale society hangs together and is relatively inclusive. And so this is part of the extended evolutionary synthesis. It's part of my title. And basically what it says is that this boundary between order and disorder is as movable for human societies as for the natural world. It's based on roughly the same dynamic of multi-level selection, operating not on genes, but on behavioral choices and on cultural evolution rather than genetic evolution, or actually both, because what I said about genetic evolution operating on ecological timescales goes for humans in addition to other species. And there's a lot of evidence indicating that genetic evolution is operating faster right now in our species than ever before. There's a book called The 10,000-Year Explosion that explores that territory. And so now let's think about the practical implications of this. This is Eleanor Ostrom. I think she's well known to many of you in this audience, hopefully needs no introduction. She is a political scientist by training, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. And what she did was she studied groups around the world that manage common pool resources. So now we're really getting to the heart of human ecology. And what she showed was that these groups are capable of avoiding the famous tragedy of the commons. They can manage their resources, but only if they possess certain core design principles. And here they are. These are the ingredients that make groups work, at least common pool resource groups. Groups work when? Number one, they have a strong group identity and purpose. They know who they are, who's in it, what they're supposed to do. If there's proportional equivalence of costs and benefits, it cannot be the case that some people do all the work and other people get all the benefits. There has to be some sense in which you get what you put into the group. Decision-making must be inclusive. If the group's not going to work, if some people make decisions and other individuals do not have input into that process. There must be monitoring. Agreed upon behaviors, you must monitor it. And then something must be done about it. There must be sanctions for misbehavior. Need not be nasty or mean. Can start out friendly. That's typically a friendly reminder is enough to keep most people in solid citizen mode, but in some cases it is necessary to escalate. There will be conflicts, and they have to be resolved in a fast and fair fashion. A group has to have elbow room to do these things, so there must be the capacity for self-governance. And finally, in a multi-group environment, there has to be appropriate relations among groups, what the Austrians called polycentric governance. And those relations must embody the same principles, more or less, as those among individuals within the group. So these are the ingredients, in a sense, for groups to function well. And I was very lucky to work with Lynn Ostrom for about 3 years prior to her death in 2012, and her postdoctoral associate, Michael Cox. And what we did was we basically, we tacked the word evolution onto her work is what we did. And I think you can see, if you go back here, if you look at these design principles and then you think of just what I've been saying about multi-level selection, how these ingredients do basically for modern groups what evidently took place for our ancestors, which resulted in the genetic evolution of our species. They make it hard to cheat within groups. In a group that has these design principles, it's simply hard to benefit yourself at the expense of another member of your group. And so what that does is it leaves teamwork as the main option for succeeding. And it's just fascinating that what modern groups need is the same as what our ancestral groups had that made us the species that we are today. I think that's a really interesting connection. So how do we apply this beyond common pool of resource groups? Let's think of the school environment. And let me ask you, how many of you had a terrific experience in high school?
I had a weird school now.
I see a smattering of hands. How many of you had a terrible experience in high school? Well, actually, it's not so different. So a lot of you are in the middle of the bell curve. And now I invite you to just think about whether whatever your experience was, could it have been attributed to the presence or absence of these design principles. And I wager that these design principles might have had something to do with it. And certainly from the perspective of many at-risk, so-called at-risk children who are not doing well in school, I think that typically these design principles are sadly lacking. And we had an opportunity in Binghamton to actually help to design a school for at-risk students in the public school system in which we were able to build in these design principles to the best of our ability. And the results were just transformative. So here we have the state-mandated exams. These exams were taken by everyone. And for 4 topic areas, we have on this histogram here is the students in our school. On the 3rd histogram here, there's students in a comparison group, and this is a randomized controlled design. What that means is that we recruited twice as many students that we could accommodate in our school, and we randomly selected among them. And then the others went back into the normal high school routine, and we have the best possible comparison between the students in our school and the comparison group. And the middle histogram is the average high school student in the city of Binghamton. So what this shows is, for all subjects, is that the students in our school vastly outperformed the comparison group and performed on a par with the average student in the Binghamton High School. In a single year, by changing the social environment, we seemingly erased the deficit of years. Now, that's strictly speaking not the case, knowing these students, but it's an amazing outcome. Okay, that's the school environment. How about the business environment? How many businesses implement these design principles well? And some do, but a lot don't. Could this be the basis for business performance? There's many socially responsible business movements. This is one. It's called B-Lab. B-Lab is an outfit in Philadelphia that set itself up as a certifying organization, kind of like the LEED certificate for buildings. They will certify your company. You submit information to them. They measure you on 5 dimensions, and if your score is good enough, then you can advertise yourself as a B Corp. And we've studied B Corps. We have a project studying B Corps, and what we've shown is actually they do very well as businesses. They're profitable. They do well by doing good. And that seems paradoxical from a certain perspective. If you have a standard business perspective, it seems if you're doing all the stuff to be socially responsible, that's got to detract from your bottom line, doesn't it? And the answer is no, because it makes the group strong. It makes the group strong. And so we have a report that's based on this that you can get from our website called Doing Well by Doing Good. I'm very proud of the work that we're doing with business communities. And not only can these companies do well as companies on the basis of their internal social organization, but they can also do well by banding together, basically, and forming a cooperative ecosystem. And just imagine, I invite you, that you're a business, you've implemented all these principles well, you're doing great as a business, but unfortunately for you, you're in a larger social environment in which you don't have like-minded businesses and other agents that you have to work with. That places you at a disadvantage. And so what you have to do is you have to recreate the design principles. That's the 8th design principle, basically, relationships among groups. And you have to implement the design principles at a higher scale. How to do that? Well, it can be difficult, but it can also be possible. And there's some encouraging signs that this is in the process of happening. And there's a virtuous upward spiral of business practices. And then for economics in general, I invite you to visit our online magazine, evonomics.com, which has a wonderful, wonderful content on basically tacking that evolution word onto economics. Now I want to spend a little bit of time on this particular project, which I've talked about with some of you, and I think should be dear to the heart of many people here at College of the Atlantic. It's a study that we're doing on intentional communities, and it's based in part on a National Science Foundation proposal to a program that they have on coupled natural and human systems. The National Science Foundation has decided that this is an important topic area, and I think that's just a fancy word for human ecology. That we have human systems, we have natural systems. They have to be coupled in a way that is sustainable. So the ideal CNH system would provide a high quality of life for its members using resources that can be sustained over the long term while also preserving and promoting biodiversity. And the question is whether intentional communities, especially those with an ecological ethic, such as eco-villages, serve as a model for this, model CNH systems. I'm suggesting that they can with this juxtaposition of photographs in which the members of this intentional communities are playing a game, a togetherness game, quite similar to the hunter-gatherer children. So the intentional communities movement is quite large, and they're also gathered into associations such as the Fellowship of Intentional Communities. Over 1,000 intentional communities in North America belong to this particular consortium, and there are others. And what we did was we worked with the FIC to distribute a survey, and we got a good response rate, over 100 communities, over 1,000 individual responses. So we have some wonderful information on these intentional communities. We've also made a study of one called Dancing Rabbit. It's an eco-village in rural Missouri. So we've studied it. I've made a site visit there, and it was a memorable experience. It's easy to stereotype intentional communities as like the hippie communes of the 1960s, not that they were so bad. And also the failed communes of the 19th century, because, of course, the communal movements go way back, and there's good scholarship on the intentional communities of the 19th century. They tended not to work very well. And the ones that weren't religious worked the worst of all. So those were not very good models. But it turns out, our survey tells us that modern intentional communities are like good models. And if you're going to compare them to anything, it would be like the small New England villages that we look upon so highly. Here I am in Maine, so I don't have to stress that point. Or those hunter-gatherer societies which have existed since time immemorial. That's what it seems that intentional communities are like. And we've developed a framing for this that I'm proud of, which distinguishes between 3 levels of care: self-care, individual well-being, group care, the community, and earth care, the welfare of the larger scale. And I've made group care central and larger here to make the main point that group care is needed for both self-care and earth care, because we're such a cultural species and small groups are such an important unit of human social organization that if you're not part of a nurturing small group, then you're unlikely to have a high degree of individual well-being. And furthermore, if you're not a member of a group, then you're unlikely to have the norms that are required in order to get you to walk the walk with respect to fulfilling an environmental ethic. And so group care is the key for both self-care and earth care. That's what the data seems to be telling us. So here's some verbal responses from the survey as to why people, their reasons for joining the community, now that they're in the community, what they most value, and what they want to change in their communities. And it's all about community. That's the bottom line. These are ranked from the top to the bottom. These are the top 10s. So much of this is about community. That's why they join. That's what they most value. And that's what they want more of when they want to change. Amazing that the number 2 ranked nomination for what to change was nothing. Here's responses to the question of how's your life been since joining the community? And you can see it's just stacked up in the direction of much better. That the people who joined this community, they're so glad they did. They regard their lives as so much better than they did before. Now here's what this means for individual well-being. There's a little survey called the Diener Satisfaction with Life Survey. It's 5 simple items. It's been given to many, many populations, and so this provides a good basis of comparison. And so here we have the results of many surveys. We can compare our survey in red for males and females in intentional communities, and you can see that self-care, basically, perceived individual well-being, how well the individual says their life is on the very high end. Females in intentional communities are exceeded only by Norwegian pregnant women and Norwegian mothers of infants. And there is no happier person than a Norwegian pregnant woman, as far as I know. And so that's a pretty good report. These are some personality variables. And we tend to think that personality is heritable because we're so brainwashed into thinking in terms of genes, that we think that everything is from our genes. And a lot is from our genes. So personality is partially heritable, but it is also influenced by environmental circumstances. And we don't know whether this result I'm about to show you is based on who came in to these communities as opposed to what happened to them after they got there. Further research will shed light on that issue. But what it shows is that the average woman in this case, the results are much the same for men in the intentional communities, ranks much higher on the personality variable of emotional stability than a general sample of American population. And I can see it both ways. I can see a filtering effect, so that's who comes in. I can also see that that's what happens to you once you get there. Because after all, just imagine your stability in an environment in which your well-being is low, as opposed to one which offers a good deal of community. I can well imagine this and other personality variables changing, including the personality variable of conscientiousness, which is one of the personality variables that doesn't change is extroversion. So if you're extroverted or introverted, that doesn't change much when you join an intentional community. Okay, so now let's get to earth care. And I wanted to read their mission statement in detail. It doesn't take long. To create a society the size of a small town or village. So they're explicitly modeling themselves on a New England village model, made up of individuals and communities of various sizes and social structures. That means they want to have diversity, heterogeneity within the village. This is not monolithic, basically. This is not you all have to believe the same thing. which also allows and encourages its members to live sustainability, which they define below. To encourage this sustainable society to grow and have the size and recognition necessary to have an influence on the global community by example, education and research. They want to be a model. They want to see more of these. Here's their definition of sustainability. In such a manner that, within the defined area, no resources are consumed faster than their natural replenishment, and the enclosed system can continue indefinitely without degradation of its internal resource base or the standard of living of the people and the rest of the ecosystem within it, and without contributing to the non-sustainability of the ecosystem outside. I think that's admirable. I actually cannot improve upon that definition of sustainability. So if you want to join Dancing Rabbits, you need to sign a covenant, and they call it a covenant. This covenant binds you to certain rules about vehicle use. You cannot own a vehicle, or if you do, it must be parked more than 10 miles from the village. The village uses 4 communal vehicles. All these other things, which include basically ecological practices, and then you have to commit to peaceful conflict resolution. Violence, of course, is not allowed. You have to contribute some of your money and your time. And if you study religions, as I do, I think that you can agree that these strictures are as strong as the strongest religious communities I know. The most fundamentalist communities, what they require of their members is not stronger than these. And yet, for those that abide by these strictures, almost anything goes. Any religious or spiritual belief, including none at all, any sexual orientation, any living arrangement is just fine if, as long as you abide by the norms that have been set in place. And so Dancing Rabbit is a fascinating combination of tight and loose. And I think that that is one of the reasons why it is a vibrant community. If it was tight in all respects, I think that would not be nearly as viable as this very interesting combination of tight and loose. They're very systematic in what they do, and so they conduct an eco-audit. And here are the results. It's been said that the average American uses 10 times more resources than is sustainable. And so the goal of Dancing Rabbit is to actually live a good life on 10% of the resources of the average American. And these numbers show that actually they largely succeed. Now, I won't go through them all, but they have to do with solid waste, recycling, car use, propane gas consumption, electrical use, water use. And then in agreement with our survey, and so this is an independent survey conducted internally, they report just being so very happy to be in their community. Then in addition to all of that, they have a strong stewardship ethic. They have something like 200 acres that they're on, and so they do restoration. They remove exotic species. They like to rotate livestock to emulate wild herds, forest gardens, permaculture, make the best use of ecosystem services. So they do that too, in addition to their light footprint upon the earth. And so that's the concept of group care as important for self-care and earth care. It does make intentional communities model systems, but I want to stress that this is not restricted to intentional communities. There's many other ways to do this. There's many kinds of groups that you can create that do this. They don't have to be all-inclusive groups. They can be groups that you basically join while, in addition to the rest of your life. So this framing, I think, is very, very important for the human ecology movement. And so I just wanted to rehearse our objectives here as I conclude. My main objective is to say that human ecology needs to become evolutionary human ecology, to explain why this is not already the case, and to provide a historical perspective. That historical perspective basically says that even though Darwin's theory is over 150 years old, so much has happened since the formation of COA. In fact, almost all of it has happened since the formation of COA. And so I would like to think that as a small institution, that is centered on the concept of human ecology, that this institution can actually have a special role in implementing this kind of human ecology. It's already taking place at the level of science and scholarship. It is being implemented in programs at other universities, including the University of Maine and Orono, and Ethan Tremblay is here, a graduate student of Tim Waring's right up the road, that are an exemplary example of this. And, but I think you do have a special advantage by virtue of your size and your mission. So thank you very much. So is there time for a few questions?
Please, yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yes?
David, so how does, I'm thinking about, Eleanor Ostrom stuff, but I'm also thinking about somebody like Robin Dunbar and his group size arguments.
Yeah.
What happens as groups get bigger and this is tougher to do. And so how do you see that feeding into this? Certainly for a place like COA, we're not 150, but we're a small group and that helps that. But what happens in terms of scaling?
Yeah, that's a great question, the scaling question. And Robin Dunbar, for everyone, is one of the main people involved in all of this. He's part of the canon, basically, observing that we're just built, psychologically built for smaller groups. And if the groups become larger than about 150, that's called Dunbar's number, then it breaks down. We just can't remember the people. We can't remember the relationships. Our minds are not made for groups larger than 150. And yet, of course, there are groups larger than 150. So what's needed are basically add-ons. Think of them as prosthetics. That these are basically products of cultural evolution. They go into the design of the institution that basically interface with our evolved psychology and make it work. A good example from religion is Calvinism when it was implemented in the city of Geneva. That city at the time was about 11,000 people, a near town by modern standards. But 11,000 is still a lot bigger than Dunbar's number. And one of the things they did was they divided it into sectors. And each sector was overseen by an elder. And the elder had to be acceptable to the neighborhood, to the sector that was governing. So that was a neat piece of social engineering. The decision-making group was not just Calvin, it was a group. In fact, the 12 apostles. And that number 12 is like an ideal group of equals. That's kind of like hunter-gatherers around a campfire, basically. And so the decision-making group was 12. Then there were these divisions. So that made each sector more like Dunbar's number. And it went on like that. And what you see in basically history is a fossil record of this, is the cultures that manage to create these prosthetics to interface with our psychology are the ones that succeeded as cultures. And such things as religions and symbols of all sorts that unite people into a group based not on face-to-face interactions, but by the fact that now we're united under a symbol, for example, is another one of these prosthetics. And this is a problem that's encountered in our work on businesses. It came up again and again and again that these businesses start out small and idealistic, mission-oriented. Everyone knows each other. All of that kind of happens so easily. But then success caused the groups to grow larger, and all of a sudden they're encountering problems that they didn't encounter before. And you really need to be prepared for that. I mean, that's going to happen. And I think the theory tells you quite a bit about what you might need to do in order to prepare for that. And I think that the COA is probably in that zone, basically. It's bigger than Dunbar's number. It's not a lot bigger, but still, especially when you consider your alumni base and all of that kind of stuff, then it does become a larger group, in which case you're going to have to think about that kind of prosthetic. Yeah?
How do you see the first principle of strong identity and purpose not necessarily leading to in-group, out-group dynamics and inter-group competition?
Right. So that's an ever-present danger. And I think that's one of the things you need to know. So many people think that to talk about how altruism evolved. So basically, only good can come from altruism. It's funny, you know, most people think that selfishness comes in good and bad varieties, but altruism, only good can come from altruism. And that's not true at all. Altruism comes in good and bad varieties, and within group altruism so often is turned to between group destruction. So that is a problem, and I think the general solution is to implement the same principles higher up the scale. I mean, why does the bad actor within a group not succeed when they don't? It's because there's sanctions, there's punishment, and all of this stuff. They're avoided. All of that can take place higher up the scales. These principles are scale independent. I also want to say that in our own efforts, especially, I haven't mentioned that we've created a tool basically for assisting groups to learn the design principles. And for groups that use that tool, that we're pretty mindful ourselves about the fact that we don't want to use you to use this for harmful purposes. So, you know, if you're a gang or something like that, a terrorist cell, these design principles will work for you. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. Any tool can be used for good or evil, but we will not help you do that. So, yeah.
Have you considered the link at all between the corporate structure of companies like Toyota and these Dunbar organization techniques?
I have. Have you also?
To a degree.
Yes. In fact, I've been really diving into the business literature for the last few years, and what you discover is that there's some companies that are famously successful. Toyota is one of them. And when you look into why they're successful, then it turns out it's for these reasons, and in some very clever ways, they have actually incorporated evolution into their organization. And one of the famous things about Toyota is that this automobile assembly plant, tremendously complex system. Actually, a theme I have not stressed is the complexity theme. And that when a group is complex, and most groups are, then it's very difficult to predict what's actually going to work. Even your best ideas are likely to fail based on unforeseen consequences. And so many businesses, for example, when they try to implement big change practices, there's a high failure rate. I love all those folk tales where somebody's granted a wish and then they end up regretting their wish. That's the moral of unforeseen consequences. And in an automobile assembly plant, it's such a complex system that if you were to try to change part of it, then very likely what you thought you were doing would have a cascade of effects that would be negative. So what they do is they have literally ropes, as I understand it, that hang down from the ceiling. And if there's any inefficiency anywhere in the system, the workman pulls the rope. And that results in a swarm of activity around that problem. And then when they implement a solution, they might have more than one idea, but they only implement one at a time. Only one at a time. And then they chart it as it ramifies through the system. And if the whole system works better, then they'll implement that. But if they were to try to implement even two of those, then the interactions would be so complex that they wouldn't be able to track it. And so there's a book called The Toyota Kata. I don't know what book that you've read, but a wonderful book called The Toyota Kata. Kata is the Japanese, the martial arts exercise, which lays this out, I think. They never use the E word, but they lay it out in beautiful detail. The Toyota Kata. Anyone up there?
No one else does.
Oh, please. Okay, well,
So David, I'm sitting here thinking that the principles that you derived seem like good social behavioral practices. And I'm wondering if the use of the evolutionary is a way of creating a context for making the argument that these are successful and can be successful. Because when I hear you speaking, I'm like, well, what he's really saying is cooperation, structured cooperation is a good thing. that your principles would be, or your advocacy for these principles would be as effective if you didn't have the word evolutionary?
I think that that's a great question, and it has a complex answer. And because I think there's a yes and no answer. I think for anyone with issues about evolution, then you get a short-term advantage out of avoiding the E word. And so that's true. And I actually do that in some circumstances. If you look at the business report, I say that there's many threads come together, like the braided strands of a rope, in support of this argument. I begin with Ostrom's of political science, economics, social science, and evolution. But evolution's not on my sleeve, okay? A second point is that I feel very strongly that, that stigmatized words have to be rescued and face value definitions have to be restored, basically. And that's true not just for evolution words, but other stigmatized words. Because so often you get, evolution is a tainted word, so should we avoid evolution? Sociobiology became a tainted word. Should we avoid sociobiology? Evolutionary psychology became a tainted word. And the world is full of psychologists that are studying psychology from an evolutionary perspective that don't want to call themselves evolutionary psychologists. That's just stupid. And so basically the short-term advantage that you get from avoiding these words does have a long-term cost. And I want to avoid that long-term cost. But my third point is that for people that don't have issues like that, and let's say even people that are thoroughly familiar with Ostrom's principles, they've gotten all they're going to get out of that. To place that on a more general theoretical foundation has a lot of added value. And to know that this emanates not just from institutional design theory or game theory, but actually it can be justified in a broader way. And so much so that not only does it apply to other kinds of human groups, but it even applies to non-human species, which you might never have thought of. That just provides a stronger foundation. And for some people, that's not just an added value. That's a huge added value to know that your foundation has become that much stronger. I'm told, and I think it's true, that Ostrom's work, not only was it unknown by economists before she got the Nobel Prize, it was a shock to economists that she got it, but it's even and remains a minority position in political science. If I ask, the concept of polycentric governance, who knows about that? The answer would be not many people, even within political science. So every position has a distribution in abundance. I think it's important to think of ideas and schools of thought as like species having a distribution in abundance. And what you find is that typically their distribution in abundance is very, very limited. And if you can find a way to actually expand the range of an idea, then that's big. So you're nodding your head, which makes me feel good.
No, I get it,
Yeah.
So you kind of, what we've seen in your presentation is a lot of quite compelling evidence as to why this system of maybe intentional communities and things like that are very effective and working. Have you noticed in your studies, or has anyone else in the field noticed any major or even minor downsides to this structure?
There are, I think, always big downsides to something like this in constraining individual agency. And I think one point to make is that groups are only needed when to do things that individuals can't do. I don't need a group for me to lift this. And if you were to try, you don't get in the way. I don't even need a group to play the violin, and that's a very complex activity. But it's still better done by an individual than by a group. And so the idea that groups are always better is not the case. Not the case at all. I do need a group to lift this and to do many other things. So you want to be smart enough to have groups that basically kick in for the things that groups are needed for, and then to provide space when they're not needed. And if I were to single out a single thing that's difficult to do in groups and yet still necessary, it would be decision making. decision-making is a very complex thing. What does it mean? What is decision-making? Basically, it's an evaluation of alternatives and a winnowing of alternatives leading to a final decision as to what to do. Well, when does an individual do all of that better than a group? And that depends very much on the particular, what they call decision-making environment. Sometimes individuals are better than groups. Sometimes a small group is better than a big group. And of course, those groups need to be structured in just the right way. And so managing the trade-off between the third design principle, fair and inclusive decision-making, it's got to be transparent. You've got to guard against disruptive, self-serving behavior. And yet at the same time, it has to be efficient. So that is a tough trick. And you'll notice that and the what to change in the community in that top 10, I believe decision-making was the number one. I love it here, but God damn it, it's hard. We're sitting in all these meetings and stuff like that. And I think I see lots of nodding heads in the COA community. We got one more. I don't know. Should we do one more? Okay. Oh, we got two more. If we can fit in two, that's fine. Okay.
I'm curious about your thoughts on how necessary the concept of altruism is for these principles, especially given the resemblance of the second principle of equivalence of costs and benefits to reciprocal altruism, which is kind of not altruism.
Right. Well, that's another great point. And altruism means many things to many different people. And often what it means is a degree of self-sacrifice, basically. Altruism is a two-dimensional concept. There's benefiting others, but there's also an individual sacrificial component. That's not what I mean by altruism. In the strict, back to relative fitness, basically, if your definition of altruism is based on a relative fitness, then that kind of no-cost behavior or something with a very minor cost counts as altruism. The bottom line is there's two kind of guiding metaphors. One is altruism. The other is organism. An organism emphasizes the coordination aspects, often mechanisms that you would not recognize as altruistic. And I think in some ways the organism metaphor is better than the altruistic metaphor. I'm agreeing with you on that point.
Actually, my question had to do with your premise that altruism is always comes at a cost to the individual.
Right.
And I just wanted to clarify that that is accurate.
Well, again, I recommend my book, by the way, Does Altruism Exist? I haven't peddled it yet, but I have now. And one of the distinctions that needs to be made is between, in evolutionary jargon, proximate and ultimate causation. We can define altruism in terms of action, basically. And we can also define it in terms of thoughts and feelings. And when it comes to thoughts and feelings, then it's often the case that the altruist in terms of action, the person that always is doing good for others, at some material expense to themselves, gets a great deal of pleasure out of doing so. And also when altruism works, in other words, groups of altruists manage to get together and benefit from their interactions, and the selfish individuals have been avoided and they're all over here, then altruists are benefiting greatly in material terms, not by their own actions, but by being in the company of other altruism. So there's all sorts of benefits of altruism, including psychic benefits. Of course, when that system of rewards and punishments is in place, I said, in part of my talk I said, you cannot explain a system of rewards and punishments based on within-group selection. But you certainly can explain them based on between-group selection. These things do evolve, and when they're in place, then the altruist is richly rewarded with social recognition, and they're just buoyed up by all kinds of praise and support and stuff like that. And the individual that's behaving in ways that would be advantageous in the absence of all of that is just hammered and so on and so forth. So I would not want to, this idea that altruism must be self-sacrificial is, again, not part of the framework. Another reason why organism should. Another point to make, by the way, is that not all forms of within-group competition are destructive. There's constructive forms. There's forms of competition within groups that are good for the groups. All kinds of friendly competitions are good for this. They're very energizing to have some kind of a contest in order to do something that's good for the group. And these things are favored by group selection, along with things that are overtly competitive. Even some arguments for free market processes, the market, the price system, and things that we associate with libertarian worldviews actually have an element of truth we would not want to do without them. They need to be appropriately restrained. But that's part of what can cause a group to work well. And that is enough.
Thank you.
Thanks.